On a freezing night in Montana, a lonely farmer opened his cabin door and found a giant black horse with two trembling foals standing in the storm. What began as a simple act of shelter soon uncovered buried secrets, fierce battles, and a final choice that would break his heart forever. Stay with me until the end, because this story will change the way you see love, loss, and the silent bond between man and horse. The blizzard had swallowed the valley whole. Snow drove across the wide plains of Montana in furious sheets, rattling the shutters of the cabin like the fists of some restless ghost. Inside, Ethan Miller sat alone beside the cast-iron stove, the orange glow of the fire flickering against his lined face. He cradled a chipped mug of coffee that had gone cold hours ago, staring into the flames as though they might burn a hole through the silence that had clung to him for years. The cabin was small, one room with timber walls scarred by decades of winters, and it carried the weight of absence. The rocking chair in the corner where his wife once mended clothes stood empty. A photograph of a girl with dark hair, his daughter, long gone to California, gathered dust on the shelf. Ethan had stopped dusting long ago. Some absences are better left untouched. The storm howled louder. The roof groaned under snow. Ethan leaned back, closed his eyes, and told himself that nothing outside could want anything from him anymore. He was a man with nothing to give, nothing left to lose. That was when the sound came. At first he thought it was the wind slamming a loose board, a dull thud, heavy and deliberate, against the wooden door. Then it came again, slow, insistent. A knock that was no knock at all, more like the weight of the world leaning against him. Ethan set the mug down. His hands, rough from years of labor and loss, hesitated above the latch. When he pulled the door open, the storm clawed its way inside, freezing his breath mid-air. And in the chaos of snow and darkness, a figure loomed. A horse. Not just any horse, a massive black mare, her coat matted with ice, steam rising from her nostrils in frantic bursts. At her side pressed two foals, trembling, their legs unsteady in the drifts. Ethan's first instinct was disbelief. Horses didn't knock on doors. They didn't stand still under the weight of a blizzard, waiting like supplicants. But the mare's eyes met his, and he forgot the storm for a heartbeat. Those eyes weren't pleading, nor wild with fear. They were deep and steady, old as riverstone, carrying a patience that unsettled him. "Lord above," he whispered, his voice breaking like a man caught praying after years of silence. The mare took a step forward, her hooves crunching against the threshold. The foals pressed tighter, one bold enough to peek past her flank, the other shrinking into the curve of her body. The heat from their breath reached him, fogging the air between them. Ethan felt the bite of the cold wind on his back, the pull of loneliness at his chest, and the gaze of that creature in front of him. He had lived years locked behind grief, convinced he could keep the world outside. But here it was, knocking anyway. His hand went to the latch again, though this time to swing the door wide. The old hinges groaned. The mare moved forward without hurry, lowering her head as though she understood the boundary she was crossing. The foals stumbled in after her, clumsy and innocent, their bodies brushing the worn frame of the cabin door. Inside, the cabin changed. The smell of smoke and iron was overtaken by damp earth, wet grass, and something raw. Life itself forcing its way back into a place that had forgotten it. Ethan stood frozen, his boots planted on the rough floorboards. The mare exhaled, and the white plume of her breath wrapped around him like a confession. He reached for an old wool blanket folded on a chair, his fingers trembling. He didn't know why he moved closer. Maybe because she had come this far. Maybe because he couldn't bear to watch anything else shiver on his threshold. With slow, halting gestures, he draped the blanket over the mare's shoulders. Her eyes flickered closed for a moment, not in surrender, but in recognition. One of the foals nosed toward the bucket of water by the stove. The other stayed back, watching him as though measuring his worth. Ethan knelt, knees creaking, and dipped a rag into warm water. He dabbed at the mare's side and found the wound, a gash beneath her left shoulder, where blood had frozen into her coat. "Easy now," he murmured, surprising himself with the gentleness in his voice. He hadn't spoken like that in years. His hand steadied as he cleaned the wound, though his eyes burned with something he refused to name. Outside, the storm roared against the walls, but inside, the rhythm changed. The stove crackled. The mare breathed deeply. The foals shifted their weight with the shy clatter of hooves on wood. The silence that had haunted Ethan's nights was gone, replaced by a new, uneven chorus. He sat back at last, rag heavy in his hand, breath unsteady in his chest. The mare turned her head toward him. Her breath brushed his sleeve, warm and close, and for the first time in years, Ethan felt the edge of something break loose inside him. "All right," he whispered, almost ashamed at how easily the words left him. "Stay. Stay while the storm lasts." He didn't realize until later that in opening the door, he had not given shelter at all. He had received it. And as the fire dimmed to embers, the cabin no longer felt like a tomb of silence, but a place waiting for morning. The cabin felt different by morning. The storm still lashed against the windows, but inside there was a heat that didn't belong only to the stove. Ethan stirred awake in his chair, his neck stiff, his hands cold against his knees. For a moment, he thought he'd dreamed it all. The knock, the horse, the foals, stumbling through the door. Then he opened his eyes. The mare stood near the hearth, her vast frame filling the room in a way that made the walls seem closer. Steam rose gently from her coat as it dried, and the blanket he had draped across her shoulders slid slowly toward the floor. One foal, dark and curious, was already sniffing around the metal bucket of water, dipping its muzzle and splashing clumsily. The other, pale as the dawn, lingered near its mother's side, wary, every movement measured. Ethan rubbed his face and muttered to himself, so it wasn't just whiskey and ghosts. He hadn't felt a presence in his cabin in years, not like this. The air carried the scent of wet hide and damp straw, mixing with smoke and old pine wood. It was foreign, yet not unwelcome. He reached for a rag and crouched beside the mare again. The wound at her shoulder looked cleaner than last night, but it was still raw. His hands, though clumsy with age, steadied as he dabbed warm water and pressed gently. The mare closed her eyes. It was not surrender. It was trust. Ethan caught himself holding his breath, as if the smallest sound might break the fragile truce between them. "Easy, girl," he whispered. His voice cracked, but the mare stayed calm, breathing slow and even. The pale foal shifted nervously, stamping one tiny hoof, but the dark one leaned close enough to nudge Ethan's arm. He let out a laugh that startled even him, a rusty, unused sound, like a gate long stuck suddenly swinging free. The stove hissed as he tossed in more kindling. The flames licked higher, throwing light on the wooden beams overhead. For the first time in years, he noticed how the walls seemed less like prison bars and more like shelter. The sound of the storm outside had changed too. Not a threat, but a song against the window panes, softened by the warmth inside. He found himself talking, words spilling without thought, as though the silence had finally cracked open. He told the mayor how the winters had grown harsher, how the bees had died off one by one until the hives sat empty. He spoke of long evenings when he had only the radio for company, and how even that he'd stopped turning on. The mare listened, her ears flicking, her breath a slow rhythm. When he finally fell quiet, the foals curled together on the rug near the stove. Their sides rose and fell in the unison of sleep, small bodies pressed close like fragile embers. Ethan studied them, and something inside him softened, a reminder of the child who used to curl by this same stove on Christmas nights, before she grew tired of winters and left for California. He rose, bones stiff, and pulled down a jar of honey from the shelf. The last of his bees had left it behind. He stirred a spoonful into warm milk and set it down in an old tin basin. The mare lowered her head, cautious at first, then drank with quiet gulps. The sound of her drinking filled the cabin like music. When the dark foal tried to climb in, Ethan nudged it back gently with his boot, grinning under his breath. "All right," he murmured. "This house was empty long enough. You stay, just for now." The storm outside began to fade, the thunder of wind giving way to a muffled stillness. Ethan stood by the window, watching the snow pile high along the fence line. He thought of the years he'd wasted pushing the world away. Strange, how in a single night, 3 strangers could change the air he breathed. He turned back. The mare lifted her head, the firelight catching her dark eyes. Something ancient passed between them, wordless yet undeniable. Ethan didn't know why, but he spoke aloud, as if declaring it to the room, to the storm, to the ghosts who still lingered. "You'll be safe here, as long as I'm standing." The words startled him, not because he said them, but because he believed them. For the first time in years, he felt less like a man waiting for winter to bury him, and more like a man who might still belong to the living. The storm broke some time before sunrise, leaving the world outside the cabin buried beneath a silence so complete it seemed sacred. Ethan stirred from a shallow sleep, the kind that left his bones aching, but his mind strangely alert. The stove still glowed faintly, a pulse of orange in the gray dawn. The mare stood guard near the door, her black coat dulled by soot and smoke, her head bowed as if listening for something beyond the walls. The foals, pressed together on the rug, dreamed with twitching ears and tiny kicks, their breath rising like wisps of fog into the cool air. Ethan pulled on his boots, heavy with thawing snow, and stepped outside. The cold bit him sharply, but the world had softened. Snow draped the fences, roof lines, and pines, every edge rounded, as though the land had been remade overnight. The silence held until his boot cracked through the crust. Then a crow called once from the tree line. He paused, looking back at the cabin, at the smoke curling faintly upward, at the shadow of the mare visible through the window. It had been years since he had stepped outside with anyone waiting for him to return. He trudged toward the old oak tree that had stood on the edge of the property longer than his memory stretched. The storm had ripped away layers of snow and soil, bearing something dark at its roots. At first he thought it a half-rotted fence post, but as he cleared the crust with his gloved hands, a corner of wood revealed itself, a box, weathered and swollen with years underground. Curiosity pried him on. With effort, he pulled the chest free. The hinges screeched in protest when he forced it open. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth that crumbled at his touch, lay bundles of seeds, dry but intact, and a leather-bound book. The pages were brittle, ink faded, but the handwriting was neat, almost ceremonial. Drawings of furrows, lunar cycles, and careful notes in an archaic hand filled the first pages. One line, underlined, twice, caught him at once. The soil remembers if the hand that tends it listens. Ethan sat back on his heels, the chest between his knees, the breath from his mouth rising white against the dawn. He turned the pages slowly, recognizing crops his father once spoke of. Barley, flax, beans. Not the high-yield hybrids the co-ops pushed, but varieties older than the county itself. His heart pounded with a strange mixture of awe and unease. These seeds had survived decades in the dark. Why now? Why here? He looked up. The mare had stepped outside, silent on the snow, her dark form cutting against the pale horizon. Her eyes fixed on the chest, steady and unblinking, as if she knew. Ethan felt a chill unrelated to the cold. He had never been a man for omens, but he could not shake the thought that the storm had unearthed something meant for more than him alone. Carrying the chest back to the cabin, he felt the weight of it not just in his arms, but in his chest. Inside, the foals stumbled toward him, curious noses twitching at the smell of old earth. The mare followed, her bulk filling the doorway until he shifted aside. He set the chest on the table, spread the book open beside the stove, and traced the words with calloused fingers. As the fire flared higher, light washed across the sketches. Furrows aligned with moonlight, companion planting, diagrams of roots interlaced for strength. It was knowledge, yes, but it was also something else. A philosophy. Farming not as extraction, but as covenant. Ethan, who had lived his life bruised by droughts, debts, and losses, felt the strange urge to believe in it. He closed the book gently and leaned back. The foals had curled at the mare's feet again, but this time the pale one lifted its head, meeting his gaze with timid courage. Ethan's throat tightened. The world had shifted in a single night. First the knock at the door, then the chest at the tree's roots. 2 invitations, both asking him to open, both impossible to ignore. "Looks like the land's got secrets," he said quietly, almost to himself. His words drifted into the still air of the cabin, where they seemed to linger longer than sound should. The day after the storm broke was brighter than Ethan expected. A pale sun pushed through a veil of clouds, and the snow sparkled with an almost deceptive gentleness. He spent the morning reading more of the book from the chest, his hands lingering over the drawings of furrows and circles traced by the moon. Every line carried the weight of voices older than his family's farm, whispers from farmers who had known how to coax life from soil without breaking it. The mare stood near the table, her shadow cast across the open pages, watching in that still way of hers, as though she understood the significance. Ethan looked up from time to time and caught her eyes fixed not on him, but on the book, and it made him uneasy. He was no stranger to animals. They had filled his life since childhood. But this was different. This felt like presence, as if the horse was guardian of something he had only stumbled upon. By noon, the foals had discovered the joy of chasing one another around the small yard, their hooves flinging powder into the air like handfuls of flour. Ethan stepped outside to breathe in the clean, sharp air, his shoulders relaxing in a way they hadn't in years. For a few fleeting minutes, the world seemed simple again. Fire in the stove, animals alive in the snow, the promise of seeds waiting to be planted. That peace was shattered by the sound of tires crunching against the frozen road. A faded blue pickup truck crawled along the path, its engine coughing. Ethan stiffened. Visitors were rare out here. Too rare. The truck stopped just short of the fence. A woman climbed down, bundled in a wool coat with a notebook tucked under her arm. She moved with the confidence of someone who wasn't afraid of the cold, her boots cutting sharp lines in the snow. Ethan recognized the type instantly. Reporter. He hadn't dealt with one in years, not since his service days when journalists had shown up to chase stories he didn't want to remember. She introduced herself with a brisk smile. Claire Turner. I'm writing about small towns surviving in tough winters. Someone mentioned a place out here, half forgotten. I figured I'd see for myself. Ethan's first instinct was to send her back where she came from. He didn't owe anyone explanations. But then one of the foals darted out of the barn and stopped at her boots, sniffing her gloved fingers before nudging her hand. Claire laughed. Clear, unguarded, and crouched down to let the foal press against her knee. Something in Ethan unclenched at the sound. He gestured stiffly toward the cabin. You'd better come inside, before the cold eats your bones. Inside, Claire warmed her hands near the stove. Her eyes wandered, catching on the mare's dark form. She blinked, clearly surprised. That's not something you see every day. A horse in the living room. Ethan gave a half smile. Didn't exactly invite her. She invited herself. Claire studied the mare with more curiosity than fear. She reached a hand out, but the mare only watched, steady and unmoving. It was the foals who bridged the distance, one bold, nosing at her coat, the other timid, half hiding. She murmured softly, words Ethan couldn't catch, and for a moment the cabin filled with a kind of warmth no stove could make. They sat at the table, steam rising from the coffee Ethan poured. Claire noticed the old chest and the book spread open, the drawings of planting patterns and lunar calendars. She traced a fingertip near the margins, her brows knitting. This isn't just a farmer's notebook. This is history, maybe even something worth more than you think. Ethan's jaw tightened. He didn't like the idea of anyone attaching value to what he'd found. Not yet. The mare shifted, her weight stamping once, and the sound echoed like punctuation in the small room. Claire set her notebook aside. Look, I'm not here to sell your story, but sometimes secrets like these deserve to be told. Otherwise, they die in the dirt. He didn't answer right away. The foals had curled by the stove again, one snoring softly. Ethan let the silence stretch, his gaze on the fire. At last, he said, "Not everything buried needs digging up." But the truth was, he had already begun to wonder. The seeds, the book, the mare who had appeared as if drawn by some thread, none of it felt like chance. Later that evening, as Claire prepared to leave, the pale foal surprised them both by stepping forward, pressing its nose against her wrist. She looked up at Ethan with quiet astonishment. "They trust fast." Ethan shook his head. "Not fast, just true. They know who they can lean on." The words stayed with him long after the tail lights of her truck disappeared down the snowy road. He stood at the window, the mare at his shoulder, both of them staring into the dark. And though he'd told Claire not everything needed unearthing, a part of him already knew the ground beneath his life was shifting. Something had been set in motion the night he opened the door, and there was no closing it again. Night dropped fast over the valley, the kind of sharp, brittle darkness that always seemed deeper after a storm. Ethan sat alone at the kitchen table, the book from the chest lying open in front of him. His fingers traced the faint lines of sketches, furrows, circles of moonlight, diagrams of roots feeding one another. He should have felt wonder, but what filled him instead was a weight pressing against his chest, a weight that had nothing to do with the seeds or the soil. The mare shifted near the stove, her shadow rocking gently across the wall. The foals had curled up close to her, small bodies rising and falling in unison. Their soft breathing filled the silence like the ticking of a forgotten clock. Ethan leaned back, letting his eyes close, and for the first time in years, memory took him whole. He saw his father's hands, scarred, cracked, always smelling of earth, guiding his younger self down long rows of beans. He remembered the way his father spoke of land as if it were kin, not commodity. And then he remembered the years that followed, the droughts, the debts, the way neighbors had sold off their fields to corporations promising efficiency and profit. He had stood stubborn against them, but stubbornness had cost him. First his herd, then his bees, then his marriage, loss upon loss, until even his daughter had turned away. The old wounds stung fresh. He pushed the book aside and rose, restless. On the shelf, under a stack of yellowing receipts, lay a letter. He had kept it, though he'd told himself 100 times he should burn it. It was from his daughter, written years ago, after the funeral, when grief had made him impossible to reach. "You shut us out, Dad. You don't know how to hold on to anyone." His jaw clenched. He had never replied. What could he have said? That she was right? That the silence was easier than watching another loved one leave? The mare stirred, as if sensing his storm. She lifted her head, her breath puffing white in the cold air of the cabin. Ethan walked over, his boots dragging. He pressed a hand to her flank, without thinking. The heat of her body met his palm, steady and alive. For a moment he felt anchored, yet even then the ache inside him whispered, "What happens when she leaves too?" He muttered aloud, voice raw, "Don't look at me like that. You'll be gone by spring." The mare blinked, unbothered, and lowered her head again. The foals shifted in their sleep, one letting out a small sound that pierced Ethan like a nail. He turned away, poured himself a measure of whiskey, and let it burn down his throat. Later, near midnight, he stepped outside. The sky was brutally clear, stars so sharp they seemed to cut the black. He stood at the edge of the yard, snow squeaking under his boots, and stared toward the oak tree where the chest had been buried. His breath smoked in the air. He thought of Claire's words earlier. Secrets like these deserve to be told. He thought of Dalton, the kind of man who would see the seeds as currency, not covenant. And he thought of his father again, bent over Rose, whispering to soil as if it might answer back. When he returned to the cabin, the mare was waiting by the door. She exhaled softly, mist curling between them. Ethan reached out without hesitation this time, resting his hand on the side of her face. Her skin was rough beneath the hair, but her warmth bled into him, steadying him against the cold and against himself. "You don't know what I've lost," he whispered, eyes shut tight. "You don't know what it costs to trust." But even as he said it, he realized she did. Somehow, she did. And that truth, silent and impossible, cut deeper than any letter ever had. The next morning broke with a gray haze, the kind of sky that seemed to press down on the earth itself. Ethan was stacking logs near the shed when he heard the growl of an engine cutting through the stillness. It wasn't Claire's battered truck this time. The sound was too polished, too certain. A dark SUV rolled up the narrow track, tires spitting snow. The man who stepped out was dressed too well for Montana backroads. Wool coat, pressed trousers, polished boots that sank awkwardly in the drift. He carried himself like someone who believed the land already belonged to him. "Mr. Miller?" he called, his voice smooth, carrying authority without warmth. Ethan wiped his hands on his coat. "Depends who's asking." "Dalton," the man said, extending a gloved hand. "I represent Agrigen. We've heard whispers about an unusual discovery on your property." Ethan didn't take the hand. He stood rooted in the snow, his eyes narrowing. Dalton smiled as if refusals were nothing new. "We'd like to discuss a partnership, something mutually beneficial." The mare appeared from the barn just then, her size filling the yard like a shadow come to life. The foals peeked from behind her, ears flicking. Dalton's smile faltered for the briefest second before he composed himself again. "Impressive animal," he remarked, though his tone carried calculation more than admiration. Inside the cabin, over coffee that Ethan poured without offering sugar, Dalton laid out his case. He spoke of opportunity, of how the agricultural industry was desperate for sustainable alternatives, of how the seeds Ethan had uncovered could be the key to a new future. He used words like market expansion, patents, and global demand. Each one dropped into the air like a stone, heavy and hollow. "You've been dealt a hard hand, Mr. Miller," Dalton said smoothly. "This is your chance to turn that around. Imagine. No more scraping by, no more worrying about bills or repairs. Agrigen can take this burden off your shoulders and reward you generously." Ethan's jaw tightened. He could almost hear his father's voice whispering about soil as kin, not currency. The mare shifted behind him, her hooves scuffing the floor. "And if I'm not interested?" Ethan asked flatly. Dalton's smile returned, thin and sharp. "Everyone is interested eventually. The question is whether you profit from it or let someone else do it for you." The words landed with the chill of threat. Ethan stared at the man, the weight of years of solitude pressing behind his silence. Finally, he pushed back from the table. "You've said your piece. Door's there." Dalton stood, brushing invisible dust from his coat. "Think it over," he said, slipping a card onto the table. "We'll be in touch." His eyes flicked toward the mare before he stepped outside, as if measuring her as another obstacle to overcome. The SUV's tires crunched away, leaving only exhaust and silence in its wake. Ethan remained standing, his hand clenched against the back of the chair. The foals shifted restlessly, sensing the tension that lingered. The mare met his gaze, steady and unyielding. He picked up the card, stared at the embossed logo, then tossed it into the stove. The flames licked it hungrily, curling the edges until nothing but ash remained. That night, Ethan sat by the fire with the chest open beside him. He turned the brittle pages of the old journal and thought of Dalton's words. Easy money, easy freedom. Yet the fire in his chest told him that selling would mean another kind of loss, one he might never come back from. He looked over at the mare, her dark shape resting quietly in the dim light. "Not for sale," he murmured. The words weren't just for her, but somehow she seemed to understand. The wind had calmed by evening, but the silence in the cabin felt heavier than any storm. Dalton's visit had unsettled Ethan in ways he hadn't expected. He told himself he didn't care, that men like Dalton had no hold over him, but the echo of that slick voice lingered. Everyone is interested, eventually. It clung like smoke, souring the taste of the air. He reached for the bottle on the shelf. Whiskey, cheap and raw, something he had kept more out of habit than need. Tonight, he drank. One glass turned to 2, then 3, until the burn no longer comforted but numbed. The foals stirred by the stove, their small bodies curled together, while the mare remained upright, her eyes following him as though measuring the change. "You don't understand," he muttered, slamming his glass down. "I built this place with my hands, gave my life to the land. And what did it give back? Nothing. Nothing but graves and silence." His voice cracked, filling the small room like a confession shouted into a church with no priest. He rose unsteadily, pacing. The mare's ears flicked, her muscles taut, sensing the storm inside him. "Don't look at me like that," Ethan barked, pointing a finger at her. "You'll be gone when the snow melts. Everything leaves." The words came sharper than he intended, but once spoken, they couldn't be pulled back. The pale foal startled, scrambling clumsily on the rug. It tried to rise, legs slipping, and tumbled hard against the wooden floor. The sound jolted Ethan sober in an instant. He dropped to his knees, gathering the trembling foal in his arms. Its heartbeat thundered against his chest, fragile and wild. His hands shook, not from drink, but from the sudden flood of shame. "I didn't mean it," he whispered, forehead pressed against the foal's neck. "I didn't mean any of it." Tears, hot and unbidden, slipped down his cheeks, cutting through years of hardness. He rocked back, holding the young creature close until its breathing steadied, and its body went still in a tentative calm. The mare approached quietly, her massive head lowering until her breath brushed his shoulder. She didn't shove him, didn't judge. She simply stood, presence alone enough to anchor him. Ethan closed his eyes, his voice breaking. "I'm scared. Scared of caring. Scared of losing again. First my wife, then my girl. I don't know if I can survive another goodbye." For the first time in years, the words left him without bitterness. They were raw, stripped bare, and the silence that followed was not emptiness, but release. The fire snapped, the foals shifted, the mare exhaled, and Ethan realized he wasn't speaking into a void anymore. He laid the foal gently back beside its sibling, then stumbled to the table. The bottle still waited, half full. He stared at it, then reached for the chest instead. The journal lay open where he'd left it, its lines steady, unwavering, as if written for this moment. "The soil remembers, if the hand that tends it listens." Ethan touched the page, with trembling fingers. He was no poet, no philosopher, just a broken man trying to keep afloat. But somehow the words steadied him more than whiskey ever could. He pushed the bottle aside, the glass toppling to the floor. shattering in the quiet. The mare didn't flinch. She remained still, her gaze fixed on him with that ancient patience. Ethan sank into the chair, exhaustion washing over him like a tide. For the first time in a long while, he let himself drift not into the numbness of drink, but into the fragile peace of knowing he wasn't alone in the room. Before his eyes closed, he whispered, "I'll try. I don't know how, but I'll try." The words carried no bravado, no promise of miracles, only the honesty of a man stripped down to truth. And in the hush of that winter night, the mare shifted closer to the stove, her body casting warmth across the cabin. The foals sighed in their sleep. Ethan, slumped in his chair, let go of the bottle, and with it, the weight of silence he had carried too long. 2 days passed since the bottle shattered across his floor. Ethan had woken with a headache and swollen eyes, but something inside had shifted. The mare stayed close, her watchful presence steady as ever, the foals full of mischief once more. He moved slower, but with a strange clarity, each step less burdened by the weight of old ghosts. The morning sky was a thin veil of blue when he heard it, the sharp crack of thunder without rain. He stepped outside, boots sinking in thawing snow, and smelled it before he saw it. Smoke. Thin at first, a faint line drifting above the hills to the west. His stomach clenched. Winter fires were rare, but the drought from the last season had left the land brittle. It didn't take much. One lightning strike, one careless spark. By afternoon, the smoke thickened into a column. The wind carried embers down the valley, orange specks that glowed like eyes in the dusk. Ethan rushed to the barn, throwing open the doors. The mare lifted her head, ears pinned, nostrils flaring at the acrid scent. The foals skittered nervously, circling close to her legs. "Easy," Ethan muttered, though his own voice shook. He fumbled with old ropes, trying to fashion leads strong enough to hold them. He hadn't moved this fast in years, his body rebelling, but there was no choice. The fire moved quicker than he expected, licking across the ridge like a beast let loose. He could hear the low roar, a sound that grew with each gust of wind. Branches cracked, smoke rolled down the slope, and in the distance, a line of flame began to crawl toward his land. Claire's truck appeared through the haze, headlights cutting the gray. She leapt out before it even stopped, her scarf whipping in the hot wind. "Ethan!" she shouted, voice hoarse. "The fire's coming fast. You have to move them." "I'm trying," he snapped, pulling the rope tight around the mare's neck. The foals pressed close, frightened but unwilling to. "Leave her side." Claire grabbed one rope, her hand steady despite the heat already stinging the air. Together they dragged the small group toward the open field beyond the cabin, where the snow still held damp ground. The flames roared closer, ash fell like black snowflakes, coating their coats, their hair, their skin. The foals stumbled, coughing. Ethan's chest burned as smoke filled his lungs. He pulled harder, the muscles in his arms screaming. Suddenly, sparks rained down, igniting dry brush ahead of them. The foals panicked, rearing and twisting against the ropes. Ethan nearly lost his grip. Then the mare surged forward, not away from the fire, but against it. She placed herself between the wall of heat and the foals, her body a shield, her hooves stamping defiantly in the dirt. For a moment, the world narrowed to that image, the dark silhouette of the horse, embers swirling around her, eyes bright and unflinching. Ethan froze, breath caught, before realizing she wasn't running. She was holding the line. "Go!" Claire screamed. She tugged at the foals, dragging them around the burning patch while the mare held her ground. Ethan followed, choking on smoke, his eyes streaming. He glanced back just once and saw the mare pivot sharply, forcing the fire's edge to break, splitting around her like a stream parting at a stone. She darted after them, her massive frame emerging through smoke, and the foals bleated with relief at her return. They made it to the wide, snow-packed field, where the fire hesitated, smothered by cold earth and ice. Ethan collapsed to his knees, coughing until his ribs ached. Claire knelt beside him, one hand gripping his shoulder. "You're alive," she gasped. "They're alive." The mare stood before them, chest heaving, smoke rising from her mane. She lowered her head, pressing her muzzle gently against Ethan's shoulder. He closed his eyes, leaning into her, too tired to resist the pull of gratitude. The fire burned through the ridge until dawn, leaving the valley scarred and blackened. But the cabin stood, the barn stood, and so did the mare and her foals. Ethan looked out at the smoldering hills, the sky painted red with embers, and felt the tremor of something new inside him. He had faced down loss again, and for the first time it hadn't destroyed him. He touched the mare's neck, his voice low, hoarse, but steady. "You didn't just survive it. You carried me through it." The words hung between them, carried on smoke and morning frost, and though she made no sound, Ethan knew she had heard. By morning the valley wore the color of ash. The ridge smoldered in long, dull seams, and the air held that sweet, bitter aftertaste fires leave behind. Ethan walked the fence line with a shovel over his shoulder, knocking down pockets of heat still clinging to the roots of sage. The mare followed at a slow distance, the foals stepping in her tracks as if the ground were learning their names. When he turned toward the cabin, he saw the first figures scaling the road, neighbors bundled against the cold, their breath ghosting ahead of them like banners. They came carrying what they had: shovels, rakes, battered coolers, a coil of hose older than anyone could remember. Old Mr. Cartwright from the south pasture held out a thermos. "Coffee. The strong kind," he said. No preamble, eyes soft with the kind of worry men don't name aloud. Behind him, 2 volunteer firefighters stamped snow from their boots, tipping their helmets to the mare as if she were a foreman on duty. One of them whistled low. "Saw her from the ridge last night," he said to Ethan. "Never seen a horse take heat like that and hold." Claire arrived last, a scarf over her mouth and soot on her cheek, with a box of medical supplies wedged against her hip. "I called the coop and the feed store," she said, hardly out of breath. "They're sending a pallet of hay. The church is doing a potluck tonight, and the county's got a wildfire relief hotline. Grants for fencing, seed, sometimes a little for lost tools." She shrugged. "I'll help with the paperwork." Ethan opened his mouth to say he didn't need help, then shut it again. The word alone felt small today, like a coat that no longer fit. He nodded once. "Thank you." The day took its shape without anyone commanding it. Cartwright and the firefighters checked the barn rafters, tapping with knuckles, listening for the treacherous creak of a beam gone soft with heat. 2 teenage boys, all elbows and eagerness, raked up char and flung it into a rusted wheelbarrow that squealed with every turn. A woman from town, he knew her face from the post office, set sandwiches and apples on the tailgate of a pickup, refilling the coffee without asking whose cup was whose. Ethan hauled water, his shoulders complaining, until Claire took the second handle of a sloshing bucket. "You don't have to," he said. "I know," she answered, "but I want to." Her eyes rested a beat on the mare. "They held for you. Let us hold now." In the lull between chores, the talk turned practical. Fire breaks, seed, whether the creek would run high enough in spring to cut a new irrigation ditch. Joel, the young mechanic who fixed everyone's tractors, mentioned the county assessor. "They'll send a home insurance adjuster if you file. Could help with the roof. Wildfire coverage is messy, but not impossible." He shrugged. "I'll walk you through it. We'll keep the suits from talking circles around you." Someone joked about mortgage refinance, and the group laughed, a quick, clean sound that shocked the air like sunlight. Ethan wiped his hands on his jeans, suddenly aware of the journal inside, the one with lunar drawings and notes about companion rows. He'd meant to keep it close, a secret talisman, but watching his neighbors carve order from ruin, he felt the hoarding impulse loosen. He went to the cabin, returned with the leather book, and laid it gently on the tailgate beside the sandwiches. "This was buried under the old oak," he said. "It's different. Not the way we've been pushed to plant." They gathered around, heads bent, as if sheltering a small fire. Claire turned pages with care. Drawings of terraces and moon phases, hand-lettered phrases. "Listen to the soil. Water is a covenant, not a commodity. Roots braid strength." Cartwright let out a long breath. "My grandfather used to talk like this. Folks said he was old-fashioned. Funny how what we abandon circles back wearing new clothes." "Maybe it doesn't need new clothes," Claire said, her voice low. "Maybe it needs new hands." They made a plan. Not a grand announcement, not a speech, just the simple math of people adding themselves together. On Sunday, when the moon rose fat and bright, they'd open a small patch of ground by the east fence, the part the fire kissed but didn't own. They'd test a few rows the way the journal suggested. Interlacing crops, staggering water, listening to the cold for when the soil wanted first touch. No one said miracle. No one needed to. That afternoon, the church potluck unfolded like a balm. The fellowship hall smelled of chili and cinnamon, coffee and wool. Folks patted Ethan's shoulder and moved on without pinning him under sympathy. He was grateful for the humble economies of care: foil pans, paper plates, a mason jar for donations labeled in Claire's quick hand, fence posts and seed. A volunteer passed around a printout about small business grants after wildfire and tax credits for solar panels. The town hoped to put on the community barn roof come summer. Practical hope, with a price tag and a form. The mare waited outside in the falling dusk, breath fogging the halo of the church's porch light. Children crept closer, palms out. The dark foal accepted their courage. The pale one lingered behind its mother, taking cautious half-steps until a girl with a pink hat stood very still, hand lowered. After a long minute, the pale foal bridged the inches, touch feather light, as if learning a language it had been born to speak. Ethan watched from the steps, hat in hand. The old ache in his chest changed into something he couldn't name. Not happiness. Something sturdier, like a post sunk deep and true. Cartwright eased up beside him. "You don't owe the land a miracle," the old man said. "Just your back and your patience. The rest is bargain." That night, the wind rose and fell, worrying the eaves. Ethan lay awake, listening, not restless but alert, as if his life had shifted a fraction on its axis and would need time to settle true. When he slept, he dreamed of roots, fine threads reaching sideways, intertwining, holding loose soil the way a hand holds another hand across a river. At dawn, he brewed coffee and stood by the door waiting for the first shape to turn up the road. He didn't wait long. They came with shovels, stakes, spools of twine. Claire carried a bucket of ash for the soil, as the journal advised. Trace minerals, memory of the fire turned into food. The teenagers dragged old rails from a collapsed corral to mark the edges of the test plot. Someone set a speaker on the fence post and tuned it to a local station talking about weather alerts and community resources, the anchor sliding into a commercial for an auto insurance quote, as if worry and ordinary life could share the same breath. The absurdity made Ethan swallow a laugh that felt clean in his throat. They worked in quiet conversation. The soil was cold, but not hostile. When the first furrow lay open, a dark seam between the snow-sugared stubble, Ethan held out the canvas pouch of seed. The kernels looked unimportant, old, unlikely. He waited, but no prayer came. Instead, he thought of the mare parting the fire by sheer will, of the foals trusting where he was weakest, of neighbors showing up because showing up is its own kind of vow. He tilted the pouch. The first handful fell like a sentence he'd needed to say for years. "Your hands," Claire said gently. "Let them be the first." He knelt, pressed the seeds into the line the way the journal described. Palm warm to cold earth, a small human weight sealing an intention. The mare watched from the fence, ears forward, the foals pressed flank to flank, their breath twinning in the cold. Ethan's chest steadied. He moved down the row, then to the next, the rhythm uncomplicated and exact. Hands, seed, earth, hush. When they finished the test plot, no one applauded. They stood a while and listened, the way you might after a hard truth is finally spoken. In the pale light, the furrows looked like quiet writing. "Now we wait," Claire said. "Wait and tend," Cartwright added. "Listening is work too." Ethan closed the journal and tucked it under his arm. He didn't feel like a man who had performed a miracle. He felt like a neighbor among neighbors, carrying a book that was no longer his alone. On the walk back to the cabin, the pale foal startled at a gust of wind, then checked itself and kept going. Ethan smiled without thinking. "Learning takes time," he wanted to tell it. "We're all learning." By evening, the valley smelled less of smoke and more of thaw. Ethan stepped into the doorway and looked over the yard. Tools coiled, snow tamped down by friendly boots, a square of dark earth waiting under the first sliver of moon. The mare stood there, immovable as a promise. He touched the doorframe with his knuckles, the way he used to when he left his child sleeping inside, and said to the night, "We'll see it through." From the field came the smallest sound, as if the ground had taken a breath and was holding it, expectant. Or maybe it was only the wind at last remembering the right way to move across a place no longer alone. The first green shoots pushed through the blackened soil faster than anyone expected. Within days of planting, the furrows were lined with tender stalks, wet with morning dew, trembling in the wind like shy promises. Neighbors stopped by daily just to look, some shaking their heads in disbelief, others whispering about God's hand, though Ethan said nothing. He only worked the rows quietly, boots sinking into thawed ground, hands in the dirt as if the earth itself were reminding him what it meant to be alive. One evening, after a long day tending the test plot with Claire and the Cartwright boys, Ethan returned to the cabin to find an envelope waiting on the kitchen table. It must have been slipped under the door while he was out. He froze at the handwriting. It was his daughter's. Years had passed since her last letter, and the sight of her name scrawled in blue ink hit him harder than any fire. He sat down, the chair creaking beneath him, and tore it open with hands that didn't feel steady enough to hold memory. The words inside were brief, brittle as dry leaves. I heard about the wildfire. I don't know why I still care. You always cared more about the farm than about us. Don't look for me now. You had your chance. The paper blurred as Ethan's vision swam. His chest tightened until he thought he might split in two. All the strength he had found in the soil, in the mare's dark eyes, in the laughter of neighbors, it seemed to crumble in his hands with those sentences. He stood abruptly, the letter shaking in his grip. The foals, startled, scrambled to their feet, ears flat. The mare lifted her head from the corner where she'd been resting. She did not move closer, only watched him with that unblinking patience, as if she had been waiting for this moment. Ethan slammed the letter down on the table. She's right, he whispered to the empty room. I drove them all away. My wife, my girl, everyone. He reached for the bottle he had shoved to the back of the shelf, fingers grazing the dust on its neck, then stopped. The weight of the mare's gaze pinned him. He could almost hear her breathing in the silence. Steady, grounding, asking him without words what he planned to do this time. His hands dropped. The bottle stayed where it was. Instead, he picked up the letter again, his voice breaking as he read it aloud, as though confessing to the cabin, to the fire, to the horse and foals. When his voice failed him, he sank into the chair and pressed his palms over his face. For years he had been a man who answered pain with silence. Now silence felt like surrender. The pale foal edged closer, hesitant, then nudged his knee with a fragile insistence. Ethan lifted his head, tears shining in the firelight. He reached out, and the foal didn't retreat. Its warm breath hit his skin, delicate but undeniable. Something inside him broke, not the way glass shatters, but the way ice gives way to water, slow and sure. He whispered, I don't know if she'll ever forgive me, but maybe I can learn to forgive myself. The mare lowered her head, brushing his shoulder with her muzzle, sealing the vow in silence. That night, Ethan placed the letter back in its envelope and slid it into the chest beside the journal. One was a record of old wisdom, the other a reminder of wounds unhealed. Together they felt like two halves of the same story, the land and the blood, both demanding care, both refusing to be ignored. When he finally lay down, the cabin did not feel like a place of failure. It felt like a place where grief and hope could stand side by side without destroying each other. And for the first time since the night of the storm, Ethan dreamed not of loss, but of spring. The snow began to recede in thin gray strips, bearing the earth like a wound slowly healing. The test plot by the east fence stirred daily with new life. Barley shoots thickened, beans unfolded, and small blossoms opened early, as if impatient with the season. Each morning, Ethan walked the rows with the journal in his hand, matching drawings to reality, his boots leaving parallel tracks that the neighbors soon joined. No one said the word miracle. They didn't need to. The land was speaking, and for once, they were listening. Claire kept her notebook tucked beneath her coat, scribbling in the margins as though afraid to lose the shape of this unfolding. She asked Ethan questions he had no answers for. About his father, about the kind of crops they once planted here, about what he thought the journal meant by listening to the soil. Ethan didn't try to explain. Instead, he knelt, pressed his palm flat to the dirt, and let the silence fill the space between them. On a pale afternoon, he worked the rows alone, the mare standing by the fence line with the foals grazing nearby. The air was still, broken only by the caw of a raven overhead. Ethan leaned down to weed a sprout and paused. The soil beneath his fingers seemed to hum, not a sound exactly, but a sensation, a pulse he felt in his skin. He froze, unsure whether it was real or the trick of a tired mind, yet when he pressed his hand deeper, he swore he felt the earth respond, like a heart answering another. He stayed that way for a long while, crouched low, until the mare gave a soft nicker from the fence. He looked up, meeting her eyes. Something passed between them, quiet but certain. She knew. He didn't need to doubt. That evening, neighbors gathered in the cabin again, the smell of stew mingling with smoke. Cartwright leaned forward on the table, his thick hands folded. "The old ways are working, Miller. Don't mean to spook you, but this isn't just your field anymore. Folks are already talking about what comes next, whether we can feed the whole valley if it holds true." Ethan shifted uncomfortably. He had never sought anyone's reliance. He had spent years avoiding it. Now, eyes turned to him as if he carried answers he didn't have. Claire softened the tension with her calm voice. "It doesn't have to rest on one man. This was never just Ethan's story. It belongs to the land, and to all of us willing to tend it." Later, when the group dispersed, Ethan lingered by the stove with the journal open. He read lines he had skipped before, the script faded but urgent. "The one who opens the soil must first open himself. What grows in the ground grows also in the keeper's heart." He shut the book quickly, almost angrily. He didn't want to believe the land was binding him to more than seed and water. And yet, when he looked at the mare dozing by the doorway, the foals pressed close to her side, he felt the truth of it tightening around him like roots. Sleep came slow that night. He lay awake, listening to the creak of the rafters, the shift of hooves on the wooden floor, the quiet breathing of animals who had chosen him without demand. In the distance, an owl called. Ethan closed his eyes and thought of the letter from his daughter, sharp as broken glass, tucked beside the journal in the chest. Both things waited for him, past mistakes and present gifts, pressing silently until he decided which to tend. Just before dawn, he rose and walked barefoot to the test plot. The ground was cold, but the shoots were alive with dew, trembling in the half-light. He crouched low, pressing his hand to the soil again. This time he didn't flinch. He let himself feel it, the low, steady hum that might have been earth, or might have been the blood in his veins. He whispered into the silence, not sure if he spoke to the land, the mare, or himself. "I'm listening." Behind him, he heard the mare shift, hooves crunching softly in the frost. When he turned, she was watching, her dark eyes reflecting the first hint of sun. The foals stood beside her, ears forward, as though they too understood that something larger than all of them had begun. The valley had begun to carry a hum of rumor. Word of the green patch, sprouting against all odds, spread faster than smoke after fire. Truck drivers at the gas station mentioned it. Women at the diner whispered about it. And even the preacher gave thanks for the miracle in the East Field. Ethan did not like the word, but he couldn't stop it from traveling. He told himself it didn't matter. Yet the way strangers' eyes lingered when they passed his road told him it did. It was late afternoon when the SUV returned. The same black vehicle, polished against the grit of gravel, the same tidy tires that didn't belong on country roads. This time, Dalton wasn't alone. Two men stepped out behind him, suits lighter, shoes thinner, briefcases in hand. They looked more like bankers than farmers, and the smell of cologne clashed with the scent of thawing soil. Dalton smiled as if he were greeting an old friend. "Mr. Miller," he said smoothly, brushing a fleck of lint from his coat. "We meet again?" Ethan stood in the yard, arms crossed. The mare moved behind him, her dark bulk filling the doorway of the barn. The foals peeked from her side, ears twitching. Dalton noticed the way they lingered, and though his smile didn't fade, his eyes flickered with irritation. "I won't waste your time," Dalton continued. He nodded to one of the men, who snapped open a case. Inside lay a neat stack of contracts, crisp and white, like snow untouched. "This is our final offer. Sign with us, and you'll have a guaranteed income for life. Repairs to your property, a new barn, new fences, new equipment. We'll cover your health care, your retirement, all of it. No more worry." The second man leaned forward, tapping a page with his pen. "All you have to do is provide access to the seeds and allow Agrigen to manage the process. You'll retain a generous percentage of the profits." The words poured like syrup, but Ethan's gut twisted. He thought of the journal's lines. Water is a covenant, not a commodity. He thought of the first shoots trembling with dew, of the mare holding the fire at bay, of his neighbors bent over the soil with shovels and hope. He shook his head slowly. "I told you. Not for sale." Dalton's smile hardened, edges cutting. "Mr. Miller, let's be practical. You're a man with no family here, no legacy. You can't shoulder this burden alone. If you try, you'll fail. And what happens then? The land goes barren again, and all this talk of miracles dies as gossip. Do you want that?" The mare stamped her hoof, the sound sharp in the silence. The foals pressed closer to her, their breath fogging in the cool air. Ethan felt their presence behind him like a wall. "I've failed before," Ethan said, voice rough but steady. "But this isn't mine to sell. It belongs to the land, to the people willing to tend it. You can't buy that." Dalton leaned back, laughter clipped and thin. "You think a handful of neighbors with shovels can stand against a corporation? You think the land will stay loyal to sentiment?" His eyes glittered. "Sooner or later, everyone takes the deal. Don't be the fool who dies poor when he could have died rich." Ethan's jaw clenched, but he didn't move. Behind him, the mare shifted closer, her head lowering until her muzzle brushed his shoulder. The gesture was simple, silent, but it filled him with more resolve than any sermon could. He met Dalton's gaze. "Take your papers. I don't want your money. I don't want your barns or your fences. What we're building here. You can't package it. You can't patent it. And you sure as hell can't own it." The two men snapped their cases shut, faces impassive. Dalton lingered, eyes narrowing, his smile gone at last. "You'll regret this," he said quietly. "The world doesn't run on poetry and promises. It runs on contracts." Ethan didn't reply. He simply turned, resting his hand on the mare's neck, feeling her breath steady under his palm. Dalton stood a moment longer, then strode back to the SUV. The engine roared, tires spitting gravel, and soon the road was empty again, save for the scent of cologne that clung bitterly to the dust. That evening, as the sun sank behind the blackened ridge, Ethan sat at the table with the journal open. Claire arrived with a sack of seed potatoes slung over her shoulder, her hair loose in the wind. She saw the look on his face and didn't ask. Instead, she set the sack down gently and said, "They'll be back. People like that always come back." "I know," Ethan said, his voice quiet. "But so will we." The mare lifted her head, eyes reflecting the firelight. The foals shifted against her, their small bodies warm and alive. And in that moment, Ethan felt not cornered, not beaten, but bound by land, by neighbors, by the fragile strength of life daring to grow where no one expected it. The days after Dalton's visit stretched long and brittle. The neighbors kept showing up, carrying buckets and tools, speaking with the kind of determination that doesn't need speeches. But beneath their quiet work ran a current of unease. People whispered, what if Agrigen came back with more than papers? What if the company pushed harder, leaning on county officials, leaning on debts? Rumor spread like frost, settling into every corner of the valley. Ethan felt it too. The weight of expectation pressed against his chest. They were looking to him, though he had never asked for it. Each morning he walked the test plot with the journal tucked under his arm, pretending the words on its yellowing pages were enough to shield them all. The shoots continued to rise, green against the gray soil, and yet the more they grew, the more he feared losing them. One evening, as the sky drained into a bitter red, he sat alone in the cabin. Claire had gone back to town for supplies, and the neighbors had returned to their own chores. The mare stood by the doorway, the foals curled close to her legs. Ethan stared at the journal lying open on the table. His daughter's letter peeked from the chest nearby, the edges worn from how often he had unfolded and refolded it. The words in his head twisted together until he could hardly breathe. Not for sale. You had your chance. Everyone takes the deal. You don't know how to hold on to anyone. He pressed his palms to his eyes, the silence roaring inside. The mare shifted, her hooves clicking against the wooden floor. Ethan looked up sharply. "You don't understand," he snapped, his voice louder than he meant. The foals startled awake, ears flat. He slammed the journal shut, the sound sharp as a gunshot. "I can't carry all of this. Not for the valley, not for her, not for anyone. I'll just lose it like I lose everything." The pale foal bolted, slipping across the floor, crashing into the chair leg. Its frightened cry cut through the room, and Ethan's anger broke like glass against stone. He rushed forward, scooping the trembling body into his arms. The foal's heart thudded against his chest, frantic and alive. "I'm sorry," he whispered, voice ragged. "I'm so damn sorry." His arms shook as he held the small frame, his forehead pressing to its soft neck. The mare approached silently, lowering her head until her breath warmed the back of his neck. She didn't push, didn't chide. Only stood as if to remind him he wasn't as alone as he believed. When Claire returned, she found him there on the floor, foal in his lap, the journal pushed aside. She didn't ask what had happened. She simply crouched beside him, resting a hand on his shoulder. "You don't have to be everything," she said softly. "Just yourself. That's enough." The words lodged deep, a truth he hadn't dared name. He looked from Claire to the mare, then to the fragile creature trembling in his arms. For years he had built walls against love, against trust, against belonging, convinced they were weights too heavy to bear. But maybe it was the walls that were heavy all along. He set the foal down gently, stroking its flank until it calmed. The mare's eyes followed him, ancient and certain. He drew a long breath, and let it out slow, as though releasing years of grief in one exhale. That night, he sat at the table and opened the journal again. The page waiting for him read, "The seed does not ask if the soil is ready. It simply grows where it is given ground." He read it 3 times, the meaning shifting each time, until at last he closed the book and looked toward the doorway. The mare was still there, her silhouette framed against the night. The foals dozed once more at her feet. Ethan whispered into the quiet, more vow than confession. "I'll stay. Even if I break, I'll stay." The cabin seemed to breathe with him then, its silence softer, its walls less heavy. For the first time, he let himself believe that breaking didn't mean ending. Sometimes it meant beginning. Spring pressed harder on the valley, the snow retreating to shadows, the soil softening with promise. The test plots now shimmered with young life, rows of barley, beans, and flax rising greener each dawn. Ethan walked among them each morning, journal in hand, as if reading scripture aloud to a congregation made of roots and shoots. The mare often followed at the fence, the foals bounding clumsily through grass, their legs still too long for their bodies. The world was shifting toward warmth, yet inside Ethan, another decision pressed colder than any winter. A phone call had come the evening before, catching him unprepared. The voice of his daughter, sharp, familiar, cracked with years of distance. "Dad, I heard more about you from strangers than from you. Maybe it's time to talk." The line had gone quiet, then an invitation had followed, awkward but clear. California, her home, a place where he could rest, far from the burden of soil and fire. She wanted him safe, wanted him close. And for a heartbeat, he almost said yes. That night he couldn't sleep. He sat by the stove, staring at the flicker of flame, the letter she'd written years ago still folded in the chest, the new phone call echoing in his mind. Safety, comfort, escape. It all sounded tempting. But when he glanced toward the barn, where the mare and foals had bedded down in straw, he felt the pull of another truth. Their presence had remade the silence that once threatened to bury him. Could he really leave it behind? The next morning, Claire arrived with a sack of seed and her steady energy. She noticed the look on his face before he said a word. "You heard from her, didn't you?" she asked gently. Ethan nodded. He didn't trust his voice, so he let silence speak first. Finally, he managed. "She wants me to come out there, to live near her, to stop all this." He gestured at the fields, the barn, the green pushing through black soil. Claire studied him, her eyes not unkind. "And what do you want?" He didn't answer right away. Instead, he led her to the rows, crouched low, and pressed his hand against the earth. The hum he'd felt before rose again. Not sound, not sight, but a pulse steady as breath. He looked back at her, his eyes tired but resolute. "I want to finish what started here. Not for me. Not just for her. For all of it." That evening he stood in the barn doorway, the sky painted copper with sunset. The mare stepped closer, her dark head lowering until her muzzle pressed lightly against his shoulder. The foals leaned against her sides, their small bodies warm and insistent. Ethan lifted a hand, laying it flat against her neck. "I've run enough in my life," he murmured. "This time, I stay." The words weren't grand. They weren't meant for anyone else. But in the quiet, the promise rooted deep. He thought of his daughter's voice, of the ache in her tone, of the invitation left open. He would still call, still try to bridge what years had torn apart, but he understood now that leaving the land, leaving these animals, would be another kind of abandonment. Staying wasn't weakness. It was the only strength left to him. When Claire stopped by later, she found him writing in the journal's margins, notes of his own, observations of soil, weather, and water. His script was rough, uneven, but determined. "What are you doing?" she asked, smiling at the sight. "Adding my part," he said simply. "If the book's been waiting this long, it ought to know we were here too." The night closed in gently, not with the heavy silence of loss, but with the softer stillness of belonging. The cabin, once a tomb of echoes, now felt like a vessel brimming. The mare shifted in the straw, the foals curled at her side, and Ethan leaned back against the wooden wall, eyes closing. For the first time in decades, he had chosen not to leave, not to run, not to bury himself in silence. He had chosen to remain, to bear the weight, to grow alongside what the soil had whispered. And though no one else could hear it, he swore the land breathed easier for it. The valley woke that morning under a veil of mist. Dew clung to the young barley, beads of silver catching what little light filtered through. The air smelled of thawed earth and new beginnings. Ethan stepped out of the cabin with his coffee, the steam rising like prayer, and saw the neighbors already gathered near the east fence. They stood quietly, waiting, eyes fixed on the rows. Something was happening. The shoots, still tender just days before, had risen with impossible speed overnight. Leaves stretched wider, roots deepened, blossoms opened as though drawn by an unseen hand. Cartwright muttered, "I've farmed this valley 50 years, and I've never seen growth like this." No one argued. They only watched as the field seemed to breathe, the soil giving back more than it had in decades. The mare stood at the fence, her black coat glistening with dew, the foals pressed close to her sides. She lowered her head and exhaled. A long, steady breath that seemed to roll across the rows. Ethan swore he saw the barley tremble in response, a ripple moving down the line like a shiver of recognition. The neighbors gasped softly, as if witnessing a truth too old for words. Claire touched his arm. "They won't call this miracle forever. They'll want to explain it, science, soil, whatever fits their reports." She paused, her eyes steady on his. "But for us, it doesn't matter. What matters is that it's alive. And so are we." Ethan nodded, his throat too tight for speech. He looked at the foals, one bold and nosing into the grass, the other cautious, but finally stepping forward without hesitation. They had changed, just as he had. Trust didn't arrive all at once. It was built, tender and slow, until one day it stood firm enough to carry weight. As the sun burned through the mist, Dalton's SUV appeared again on the road, a dark shape against the brightness. The neighbors stiffened, hands tightening on shovels, hose, even coffee mugs as though ready to defend. But this time, Ethan didn't tense. He only straightened, his boots planted firm in the soft soil. Dalton got out alone. No briefcases, no contracts, just a grim set to his mouth. "You've made your choice, then," Dalton said. His voice had lost its silk. "Don't come begging when it collapses." Ethan met his gaze, calm. "It won't collapse. Even if it does, we'll build again. You don't understand, Dalton. This isn't about profit, it's about belonging. Dalton sneered, turned sharply, and drove away. Dust rose in his wake, but the valley didn't flinch. The people stayed. The mare stayed. The foals pressed against their mother, eyes clear. The field shimmered under the new sun. That evening, after the neighbors left and silence returned, Ethan sat on the cabin steps. He held the journal open on his lap, his own uneven handwriting joining the faded script of the past. He wrote simply, "The land answered when I stayed. It gave me back a life I thought was lost." The mare approached quietly, lowering her head until her forehead brushed his. He closed his eyes, feeling her breath warm against his skin. The foals circled once, then settled in the grass, their small bodies outlined by the last gold light. Ethan whispered into the dusk, not to anyone in particular, but to the soil, the horse, the ghosts of his past. "I thought I was the one giving shelter that night. But the truth is, you rescued me. You taught me to stay." The wind moved gently through the field, carrying the scent of barley and earth. The cabin behind him no longer felt like a prison. It felt like home. And though his daughter's forgiveness remained uncertain, though the future held its shadows, Ethan understood at last. Life didn't wait for perfection. It grew where it was given ground. As darkness folded over the valley, the mare lifted her head and let out a low, steady nicker, deep and resonant. It was not a cry of fear, nor a call of command. It was a benediction, the last whisper of a truth too large for words. Ethan breathed it in, and for the first time in years, the silence of night felt like grace. And now, I want to hear from you. If a giant horse and her foals came to your door on a stormy night, would you let them in? Comment a simple 0 if this story touched your heart, or 1 if you want to see more stories like this. Don't forget to subscribe and ring the bell, because the next stories I'll share will take you even deeper into the incredible bond between people and horses.